Every night at San Diego Airport, a quiet librarian arranged old books in a small corner. No one seemed to notice. Passengers hurried past. Most never even looked his way. But a little girl sat beside him every evening listening as he softly read stories aloud. To everyone else, he was just Brandon Cole, the airport librarian. Until one afternoon, a Marine commander stopped in her tracks after seeing the name printed inside one of his books. Her face turned pale, because the man who quietly handed out free books to strangers was the same writer whose words had saved thousands of soldiers from despair. And somehow, the entire world had forgotten who he was. By late afternoon, San Diego International Airport had a certain kind of light that made everything look softer than it really was. It came through the tall windows in long golden bands, slipping across the polished floor, touching rolling suitcases, paper coffee cups, tired shoes, and the edges of metal seats. The loudspeakers kept speaking in calm, practiced voices about departures, delays, and final boarding calls, but in one small corner near a waiting area, not far from the domestic gates, the world seemed to lower its voice. There, tucked between a newsstand and a wall of windows, stood a narrow free bookshelf no taller than a man's chest. A hand-painted sign above it read, "Take a book, leave a book, or just rest a moment." Most people passed it without more than a glance. Airports were built for motion, not stillness. People moved with purpose there. They hurried toward gate numbers, toward reunions, toward business meetings, toward funerals, toward vacations. They had saved for all year. Very few people entered an airport expecting to be changed by a bookshelf. But Brandon Cole knew better. Brandon sat beside the shelf on a plain wooden chair that had lost some of its shine years ago. He was a middle-aged man with kind eyes, a quiet face, and the unhurried posture of someone who had long ago stopped believing that everything important had to happen quickly. His sweater was charcoal gray, his slacks neatly pressed, and his reading glasses rested low on his nose when he leaned over to sort through the returned books. He handled each one with the same care another man might give a family photograph. A children's story with bent corners, a paperback mystery swollen from having once gotten wet, a book of poems with underlined verses, and a train ticket forgotten inside. He straightened covers, smoothed pages, set aside damaged copies for repair. Now and then he opened a front cover and with a blue pen wrote a short note in tidy handwriting. Not in every book, only in the ones that seemed to ask for it. At his feet sat a small canvas bag full of donated books that had arrived that morning. Beside him, curled into the neighboring chair with her knees tucked up, was his daughter Mia. Mia was 8, and she belonged to that rare kind of childhood that still noticed things. She noticed cloud shapes, misspelled words, the way strangers sighed when they were lonely, and the sound a suitcase wheel made when it was about to break. That afternoon, she wore a yellow cardigan over a white dress printed with tiny blue flowers. Her dark hair was gathered into a loose ponytail that had already begun to fall apart. She was reading a chapter book with her lips moving silently over the words. Every few minutes she would look up and ask a question. "Daddy," she said, now holding her place with one finger. "Do you think people choose books? Or books choose people?" Brandon smiled without looking up. He was placing 3 travel memoirs in a neat row by height. I think he said sometimes people only realize what they needed after a book has already found them. Mia considered that seriously, as she considered most things. That means books are a little bit sneaky. "A little," Brandon said. She nodded, satisfied. "I like that." A plane took off outside its roar, muffled by glass. A toddler somewhere nearby began to cry and was quickly comforted. A woman in a business suit passed with a phone pressed to her ear, speaking in low, urgent bursts. A group of tourists in matching baseball caps moved past, laughing, pulling bright red luggage behind them. Brandon kept working, as if the noise around him belonged to another climate. There was nothing dramatic about what he did in that little corner of the airport. That was part of its beauty. He was not there to impress anyone. He did not call attention to himself. He did not try to turn the shelf into a performance. He simply kept it alive. He made sure the books were clean, inviting, and easy to reach. He helped travelers find something light for a long flight, or something comforting for a lonely one. He suggested animal stories to children, and memoirs to widowers, and mysteries to college students who looked like they had not slept enough. Sometimes he listened more than he spoke, and sometimes, when a child seemed nervous about flying, he knelt to the child's level and slipped a folded note into the first page of a book. Mia had discovered this months ago. "What do you write to them?" she had once asked. "The truth," he said. "What truth?" "The kind people can carry." That afternoon, she watched him open a worn copy of Charlotte's Web and write something inside. "What did you put in that one?" she asked. He handed it to her. Mia read the line aloud in a careful voice. "Books do not make a room quieter. They make the heart less alone." She looked up at him. "Did you just think of that?" Brandon shrugged gently. "Maybe the book did." Mia smiled the proud smile children have when they believe their parent knows something about the world that other people do not. To her, her father was not simply the keeper of a shelf. He was the man who could repair torn pages with invisible tape, who never seemed annoyed when she asked too many questions, who knew exactly which stories were sad, in a safe way, and which ones were sad, in a dangerous way. He could make a place feel gentle just by sitting in it. For Mia, the little airport library was not strange at all. It was one of the most natural places in the world. It was where her father belonged. An older man in a windbreaker slowed near the shelf and stared for a moment. "You run this?" he asked. Brandon stood halfway polite as always. "I help take care of it." The man glanced at the books. "Didn't know people still read much in airports." Brandon smiled. "Some do when they're tired of staring at screens." The man huffed a quiet laugh. "Fair point." He reached for a paperback West and turned it over in his hand, then tucked it under his arm before walking away. Mia watched him go. "You knew he'd pick that one." "I had a suspicion." "How he looked like someone who misses open land." Mia blinked. "Can you tell that from shoes?" "Sometimes from shoes," Brandon said. "Sometimes from how long a person holds a book before putting it back." She lowered her book. "Can people tell things about us?" Brandon sat down again and folded his hands loosely in his lap. For a moment, he looked not at the shelf, but at the moving river of strangers passing them by. "Yes," he said, "but not always the right things." Mia tilted her head. "What do they think when they see us?" He turned to her, and his expression softened. "Maybe they think we're just waiting for a flight. Aren't we?" "In a way," he said. That made her giggle, though she did not fully understand it. A pause settled between them, warm and unforced. Then Brandon said quietly, almost to himself, "Life is kinder when you stop asking it to hurry." Mia repeated the sentence under her breath, storing it away, the way children store away lines they will one day need. The airport lights grew brighter as the natural light outside began to fade. Reflections shimmered on the glass. The overhead announcements seemed gentler in the evening, as if even the speakers understood that tired people needed softer news. Brandon reached into the donation bag, and drew out a hardback with a faded blue jacket. It was older than the others, and had the particular worn dignity of a book that had been read more than once by people who took care of it. He brushed a thumb lightly over the cover before placing it on the middle shelf. Mia leaned over. "That one's pretty." "It is." "What's it about?" Brandon glanced at the title, then at her. "Some stories are better discovered at the right time." She accepted that answer, though only barely. For a little while they sat in companionable quiet. Mia reading, Brandon sorting. Travelers passing, announcements rising and fading overhead. The whole airport seemed to breathe around them. Then a shadow fell across the shelf. Not a heavy shadow, just the kind made when someone has stopped walking. Brandon looked up. A woman stood a few feet away, still holding the strap of her carry-on bag. She was perhaps in her 40s, neatly dressed, with the tired but steady face of someone who had been carrying more than luggage for a long time. Her eyes were fixed not on the sign, not on Brandon, but on the faded blue hardback in the center of the shelf. Something in her expression changed as she looked at it. Not surprise exactly. Recognition. Slow quiet, and deep enough to make her forget for a moment that she was in an airport at all. Mia noticed it too and lowered her book. The woman stepped closer. Then she reached toward that one particular book, as though it had been waiting for her. Morning arrived at San Diego International Airport long before the sun fully rose. By 6 o'clock, the terminal already hummed with the quiet urgency of travel. Rolling suitcases whispered across the polished floor. Coffee machines hissed behind crowded counters. The overhead speakers spoke in their calm, familiar rhythm. Flight 274 to Seattle, now boarding at Gate 18. For most travelers, mornings at the airport felt rushed, a blur of schedules and departure times. But in the small corner near the windows, the free airport bookshelf woke up slowly. Brandon Cole arrived every morning a few minutes before the first rush of passengers. He unlocked the small storage cabinet nearby, carried out a folded cloth, and began wiping the shelves with careful, patient motions. Dust from yesterday's traffic, a fingerprint on the edge of a paperback, a bookmark someone had left behind. None of these things bothered him. In fact, he seemed to take quiet satisfaction in them. To Brandon, every small sign meant the books had lived another day among strangers. Across from him, Mia sat cross-legged in her chair, with a small stack of picture books beside her. Her legs were too short to reach the floor, so they swung gently back and forth as she read. She had already finished 2 books before most of the airport had even finished its first cup of coffee. "Daddy," she said, suddenly, lowering the book in her lap. "This rabbit is lost again." Brandon glanced over. "Same rabbit as yesterday, yes. And did he find his way home?" "Not yet." Brandon smiled softly. "Then keep reading." Mia nodded seriously and returned to the story. The first traveler to approach the shelf that morning was a young man wearing wireless headphones and a bright blue backpack. He stopped for half a second, looked at the books, then laughed quietly to himself. "Wow," he muttered to no one in particular. "A library in an airport." He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, and shook his head. "Kind of cute, though." He walked away without touching a single book. Mia looked up. "Why didn't he take one?" Brandon shrugged gently. Maybe he already found what he wanted. She looked down at the phone in the man's hand as he disappeared into the crowd. "I don't think so." Later that morning, 2 airport employees stopped nearby while pushing a cart stacked with cleaning supplies. One of them, a tall man with a red badge clipped to his jacket, noticed Brandon sitting beside the bookshelf. He nudged his coworker with a grin. "Look at that." The other man followed his gaze. "What?" The guy who gets paid to read books all day." They both chuckled. The first man raised his eyebrows toward Brandon. "Not a bad gig, huh?" Brandon looked up from the stack of novels he was sorting. He smiled politely. "It's a peaceful corner." The man laughed again. "I bet it is." "In this place, that's a miracle." His coworker leaned closer to the shelf and read one of the book titles. "And I haven't opened a book since high school." "Why would you?" The first one replied. "You've got a phone now." He tapped the screen in his hand. "Everything's in here." The two men moved on, still laughing lightly as they pushed their cart down the terminal. Mia had heard everything. She watched them disappear into the moving crowd before turning slowly toward her father. "Daddy, yes. Why do people laugh about books?" Brandon placed the last book carefully onto the shelf before answering. He didn't rush his words. He rarely did. "Some people," he said gently, "forget that quiet things can still matter." Mia frowned slightly. "But books aren't quiet." Brandon tilted his head. "No. They're full of talking," she insisted. "And dragons, and forests, and people getting lost." He chuckled softly. "That's true." Mia hugged her book closer. "So why do they think books are boring?" Brandon rested his elbows on his knees and looked out across the terminal. Travelers streamed past like a slow river of color and motion. Some looked tired. Some looked excited. Some looked like they had not slept in days. "People don't stop believing in books all at once," Brandon said after a moment. Mia waited. "They just get very busy," he continued. "And when people are busy for a long time, they forget how to listen to quiet stories." Mia thought about that. Then she asked, "Do they remember again?" Brandon smiled. "Sometimes." The late morning crowd thickened. A group of college students dropped into nearby chairs, talking loudly about weekend plans. One of them picked up a book from the shelf, flipped through 3 pages, and shrugged. "Man, this thing doesn't even have pictures." His friends laughed. He placed the book back down upside down and returned to scrolling on his phone. Brandon stood quietly, walked over, and turned the book upright again. He didn't say anything. He didn't correct them. He simply restored the book to its place. Mia noticed. "You didn't tell them they were wrong." Brandon returned to his chair. "About what?" "That books are better." Brandon leaned back slightly. "Books don't need defending." "Why not?" "Because the people who need them will always find them." Mia considered that for a long time. By early afternoon, sunlight flooded the terminal windows again. Outside, planes taxied slowly across the runway. Inside, the airport had reached its busiest hour. Suitcases rolled past. Boarding calls echoed through the speakers. The smell of roasted coffee drifted through the terminal air. Yet the small bookshelf remained what it had always been. A quiet pause in a noisy place. From time to time, someone stopped. A woman searching for something light to read. A child drawn by colorful covers. A traveler too tired to keep staring at their phone. Not everyone believed in books anymore, but some people still needed them. And Brandon Cole never seemed bothered by the difference. He continued arranging the shelf, smoothing pages, writing a small note in the front of a returned book. Mia leaned over to read it. "What did you write this time?" Brandon handed the book to her. She read the line slowly. Sometimes a book waits patiently until the exact moment someone needs it. Mia smiled. "That's my favorite one so far." The afternoon light shifted again. Passengers moved through the terminal like changing tides. For a moment, the corner beside the bookshelf grew quiet. Then someone new entered the waiting area. Not rushing, not looking at their phone. Just walking slowly, scanning the seats and the windows. Their gaze drifted across the terminal, then paused. Something about the little shelf, its quiet order, its rows of worn books, The father and daughter sitting beside it seemed to pull their attention. They slowed, took a few steps closer, and stopped in front of the bookshelf, as if something there had been waiting for them all along. The afternoon light at San Diego International Airport had begun to soften into evening. Large windows along the terminal caught the last warmth of the sun and scattered it across the polished floor like a sheet of quiet gold. Outside, planes moved slowly along the runway. Inside the airport lived in its usual rhythm, rolling suitcases, soft conversations, distant boarding announcements echoing from gate to gate. Flight 619 to Denver now boarding in Group 3. Most travelers barely noticed the sounds anymore. They passed through them, like water moving through a stream. But Commander Rachel Morgan heard every one of them. After 12 hours in the cockpit of a military transport aircraft, her senses were still tuned to details. Engine vibrations, changes in weather patterns, the quiet tension of long flights over dark water. Even now, walking through the civilian terminal, with her small carry-on bag beside her, part of her mind still listened the way pilots always did, for problems, for changes, for silence where sound should be. Rachel was tall and composed, her dark hair pulled back neatly, her uniform jacket folded over one arm now that she was off duty. The lines of her face carried the calm discipline of someone who had spent years learning how to remain steady in uncertain skies. But behind that composure lived something older, something quieter. Like many people who had spent time close to loss, Rachel had learned that strength often arrived in the form of quiet endurance rather than dramatic courage. She moved through the terminal slowly, letting the noise of travel settle around her. All she wanted now was a quiet place to sit, somewhere away from screens, away from announcements, away from the constant movement of people. Her eyes drifted across rows of metal chairs, busy charging stations, crowded coffee stands. Then she noticed something unusual, a bookshelf. Not a bookstore, not a display stand, just a simple wooden shelf tucked into the corner beside a row of windows. Above it hung a small painted sign. Take a book, leave a book, or just rest a moment. Rachel slowed. Airports were not known for offering quiet things. Yet here was something oddly gentle sitting in the middle of a place built entirely for movement. And beside the shelf sat a man. He looked ordinary in the way certain calm people often do. Middle-aged, reading glasses, a charcoal sweater. He was carefully arranging books with slow, deliberate movements, as if each one deserved a moment of attention. Near him, a young girl sat reading in a chair, her legs swinging lightly above the floor. Rachel noticed the girl first. Children in airports often looked bored or restless. But this one was completely absorbed in her book. That alone was unusual. Rachel stepped closer without fully realizing she had done so. Her boots made a quiet sound against the floor. The girl looked up briefly. They shared a polite smile before the girl returned to reading. Rachel's attention shifted to the shelf. Most of the books were ordinary paperbacks, travel memoirs, novels, children's stories. Then her eyes stopped. One title among them felt strangely familiar. A faded blue hardcover resting near the center. Rachel's hand moved almost automatically. She lifted it from the shelf. For a moment, she simply stared at the cover. The Quiet Harbor. The title stirred something deep in her memory. She hadn't seen that book in years, but she had once carried it everywhere, in flight bags, in hospital waiting rooms, in small temporary apartments that came with military assignments. The memory returned slowly. Years ago, during one of the most difficult chapters of her life, someone had handed her that book without explanation. Just read it, they had said. She had. And somehow quietly it had helped. Not with grand answers, but with something gentler: permission to keep going. Rachel ran her thumb slowly across the cover. The edges were worn, as if many people had held the book before her. She opened it carefully. Inside the first page, a line had been written in blue ink. Not printed. Handwritten. She leaned slightly closer to read it. "Books help us find our way home." The handwriting was calm and deliberate, simple, unpretentious, but the words landed with surprising weight. Rachel stood still for several seconds. Airports are places where thousands of lives cross paths for only a moment. People arrive with stories already in motion. They leave before anyone has time to understand them. Yet sometimes, very rarely, something small appears in the middle of all that movement and reminds a person of where they have been, or who they used to be. Rachel closed the book halfway, her eyes lingering on the sentence. A quiet thought crossed her mind. Books are strange companions. They do not know the reader. They do not know the circumstances in which they will be opened. Yet sometimes, a page written years earlier can arrive at exactly the moment someone needs it most. It is almost as if certain words travel through time, patiently waiting for the right pair of eyes. Rachel had felt that once before with this very book. And now, unexpectedly, here it was again, in a small free library in the corner of an airport. She looked up for the first time toward the man sitting beside the shelf. He had returned to organizing a stack of paperbacks, unaware that the book in her hands carried meaning far beyond its worn cover. His daughter glanced up at him with a question about the story she was reading. He answered quietly, his voice calm and patient. Rachel watched the small exchange. There was something steady about the man, something unhurried. In a place built entirely around schedules and speed, he seemed almost untouched by the rush around him. Rachel looked back down at the handwritten line. Then, once more, toward the man beside the shelf. Curiosity stirred. Not suspicion. Just the quiet curiosity that appears when a small mystery enters an otherwise ordinary moment. She stepped closer. The movement caused the little girl Mia, though Rachel did not yet know her name, to glance up again. Rachel offered a gentle smile. Then she turned to the man. "Excuse me," she said politely, holding up the book. "Where did you get this book?" The man looked up. His eyes were calm, thoughtful. For a brief moment, the two of them simply regarded each other across the small shelf. Then, Brandon Cole opened his mouth to answer, and Rachel realized she had just stepped into a conversation she had not expected to begin. For a moment after Rachel Morgan asked her question, the world seemed to slow. Not the airport itself. San Diego International continued moving with its familiar rhythm. Suitcases rolled across the polished floor. The scent of roasted coffee drifted from a nearby cafe. An announcement echoed gently overhead. "Passengers for Flight 328 to Phoenix, please proceed to Gate 22. But around the small bookshelf near the window, a quieter space seemed to settle. Brandon Cole looked up from the book he had been arranging. His eyes rested briefly on the worn hardcover in Rachel's hands. The Quiet Harbor. He gave a small, polite smile. "It was donated," he said simply. Rachel nodded, though the answer did not fully satisfy the curiosity that had begun to stir inside her. She looked back down at the book. The cover was faded, the corners softened by time, and many readers. This was not a new copy. It had clearly traveled through many hands before arriving on this quiet shelf in the airport. Rachel opened it slowly. The pages carried that faint, comforting scent. Old books often have a mixture of paper time and the invisible traces of everyone who had read them before. She turned to the first page and began reading again. There are moments in life when the air feels too heavy to breathe. Not because the world has stopped moving, but because the heart has. Rachel's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the page. She remembered that line, years ago when her life had felt exactly like that. A long silence lived behind her eyes as she read the next paragraph. In those moments, people often search for strength. But strength is not always what the heart needs first. Sometimes the heart simply needs a quiet harbor, a place where the storm is allowed to pass. Rachel closed her eyes for a second. Not out of sadness, out of recognition, because there had been a time when those words had found her at exactly the right moment. It had been years earlier. A winter evening in a small apartment far from home. Rachel had just returned from a difficult assignment overseas. The kind of assignment that left people carrying memories they did not always know how to speak about. She remembered sitting on the edge of her bed, the room dark, except for a small lamp. Someone she could barely remember who had given her the book that day. She had not expected much from it. But sometime around the third chapter, she realized something strange had happened. Her breathing had slowed. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough to remind her that life could still move forward one quiet moment at a time. Rachel opened her eyes again. The airport returned around her, the distant announcements, the rolling luggage, the murmur of conversations. But the feeling lingered. She glanced around the waiting area. To her mild surprise, someone else nearby had noticed the book in her hands. An older man sitting a few chairs away leaned forward slightly. He wore a worn denim jacket and held a boarding pass loosely between his fingers. His gaze rested on the title. "The Quiet Harbor," he said softly. Rachel looked toward him. "You've read it." The man nodded slowly. "After my son passed," he said. His voice was calm, but the words carried a quiet weight. "My neighbor brought it over one evening. Said I didn't have to read it all. Just a few pages." He smiled faintly. "Ended up finishing the whole thing in 2 nights." Rachel didn't reply right away. Some stories didn't need more words added to them. The man gestured gently toward the book. "That one helped me breathe again," he said. Then he leaned back in his chair, as if the conversation had completed itself. Not far away, a woman with silver hair who had been browsing the shelf paused. She looked toward Rachel. "That book travels," she said with a knowing smile. Rachel raised an eyebrow. "You've read it too?" "Twice," the woman replied. "Once after my husband passed, and once again, years later, when I thought I had forgotten how to enjoy quiet mornings." Her eyes softened. "Some books don't just tell stories." Rachel nodded slowly. "Yes." The woman gestured toward the shelf. "They remind people how to keep living." She selected another book from the shelf and walked away toward the seating area. For a few moments, Rachel simply stood there. It was a strange experience, to hold a book that seemed to carry a trail of quiet gratitude wherever it went. Airports were places where people rarely shared personal stories with strangers. Yet here in the corner beside a modest bookshelf, 3 different lives had briefly intersected through the same pages. Rachel glanced down again. A thought came to her then, one that many readers discover eventually. Some books exist simply to entertain. Some exist to teach. But every so often, a book appears whose true purpose is something else entirely. To steady the heart. To slow the breath. To remind someone somewhere that they are not the only person who has ever carried pain quietly. Books like that do not shout. They wait patiently, until someone opens them at exactly the moment they are needed. Rachel turned back to the first page. Her eyes drifted once more to the handwritten line. "Books help us find our way home." Something about it stirred her memory again. Not the sentence itself. The handwriting. She leaned slightly closer. The letters were neat and deliberate, the strokes steady. Each word spaced with calm precision. Rachel felt a small flicker of recognition, because she had seen handwriting like this before. Years ago, inside a copy of this same book. She remembered opening that earlier copy in her apartment and finding a note written inside. A short message from someone who had signed the book when it was first given to her. The letters had looked exactly like this. Rachel's gaze lifted slowly from the page. She turned her head toward the man sitting beside the bookshelf. Brandon Cole. At that moment, he was kneeling beside a young boy who was trying to decide between two adventure novels. Brandon pointed gently at one of them. "If you like treasure maps," he said warmly. "That one has 3. The boy's eyes widened. 3? Brandon nodded. "Hidden ones." The boy grabbed the book instantly. Rachel watched the exchange. There was something quietly attentive about the way Brandon interacted with people. He listened carefully. He spoke simply. He seemed entirely uninterested in drawing attention to himself. And yet, Rachel's eyes drifted back to the handwriting, then again to Brandon. The thought returned stronger now. She closed the book slowly. The soft thud of the cover echoed faintly in the quiet corner of the terminal. Brandon glanced up. Rachel met his eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Rachel held the book slightly toward him. "I think," she said thoughtfully, "I've seen this handwriting before." Brandon looked at the book, then back at Rachel. His expression remained calm, untroubled, as if the sentence had not surprised him at all. And in that quiet moment between them, Rachel felt the first real hint that the man sitting beside the airport bookshelf might be connected to the story in her hands, in a way she had not yet fully understood. For a moment after Rachel Morgan spoke about the handwriting, the little corner beside the airport bookshelf grew strangely quiet, not because the airport had slowed, far from it. Behind them, the terminal continued in its steady rhythm, rolling suitcases humming across the floor, distant conversations rising and falling, and the calm voice of the overhead announcer gliding through the air. Final call for passengers traveling to Salt Lake City. But near the bookshelf, something subtle had shifted. Rachel still held the quiet harbor in both hands. The book no longer felt like an ordinary paperback pulled from a shelf. It felt like something alive with quiet history. And Brandon Cole was looking at it with the same calm expression he had shown all afternoon. Not defensive, not surprised, simply attentive. Rachel studied him for a moment. She had spent enough years flying aircraft to recognize a particular kind of stillness in people, the stillness of someone who had learned to live comfortably with silence. Brandon carried that stillness easily, which made her curiosity grow stronger. She held the book up slightly. "This book," she said gently, "has traveled a long way." Brandon nodded once. Books often do. Rachel glanced again at the handwritten line inside the cover. "Books help us find our way home." She closed the book slowly. "I've seen that handwriting before," she said again. Brandon didn't react in any obvious way. He simply folded his hands lightly in front of him. Rachel tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You must know a lot about it." Brandon shrugged almost apologetically. "I know a little." It wasn't the answer of someone eager to explain themselves, but it wasn't a denial either. Rachel felt the strange sensation of standing near the edge of a quiet discovery. Sometimes recognition didn't arrive like thunder. Sometimes it came like fog lifting slowly from water. She glanced down again at the book. Then she asked the question that had been forming quietly in her mind. "Did you ever meet the man who wrote this book?" The words settled gently between them. Brandon's eyes rested on the cover for a moment. Then he looked back at Rachel. "Yes," he said. His voice was calm. "More than once." Rachel blinked. It was such a simple answer that for a second she wasn't sure what to do with it. Across the small table, Mia had been quietly watching the exchange. She had lowered her own book without anyone noticing. Children often understood conversations long before adults realized they were listening. Mia smiled brightly at Rachel. "Daddy writes stories all the time," she said cheerfully. Rachel turned toward her. "Does he?" Mia nodded enthusiastically. "Oh, yes. Sometimes in notebooks, sometimes in books." She pointed toward the shelf. "And sometimes he writes little messages for people." Rachel felt a small spark of surprise run through her. Not because of the words themselves, but because of the way Mia had said them, with the comfortable certainty children have about things that feel completely normal in their world. Rachel looked slowly back at Brandon. He gave Mia a gentle glance, the kind parents use when they recognize a child has said something truthful, but perhaps slightly too revealing. But he didn't correct her. He simply reached for another book from the donation bag and began smoothing its cover. Rachel watched him carefully. "Stories?" she asked. Brandon nodded. "Everyone writes them," he said quietly. Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Not everyone publishes them." Brandon gave a small smile. "Most stories don't need to be published." The overhead lights flickered slightly as evening deepened outside the terminal windows. Their reflection shimmered across the glossy surface of the quiet harbor, resting in Rachel's hands. People walked past the small library without noticing the conversation unfolding beside it. A businessman hurried toward his gate. A child tugged impatiently at her mother's hand. A group of college students laughed loudly as they passed. None of them realized that in this quiet corner, a small moment of recognition was slowly unfolding. Rachel turned the book over again. The worn cover felt familiar now. Not just the book, the man sitting beside it. She remembered something else suddenly. Years earlier, when she had first received her copy of The Quiet Harbor, there had been a signature on the inside page. Not flashy, not theatrical, just a calm, simple name, and handwriting that looked exactly like the line inside this book. Rachel glanced once more at Brandon's hands. They moved slowly, carefully, placing a returned book back on the shelf, the same careful strokes she had noticed in the handwriting. Rachel felt a quiet certainty forming, not a dramatic realization, just a quiet understanding settling into place. She spoke softly. I think I finally understand something about this book." Brandon looked up, but he didn't ask what she meant. He didn't lean forward. He didn't offer an explanation. Instead, he simply reached toward Rachel and accepted the book when she handed it back. His fingers brushed the cover lightly. Then he turned and placed The Quiet Harbor back onto the shelf. Carefully, exactly where it had been before. Rachel watched the gesture. A man placing a book on a shelf. An ordinary motion. Yet somehow, it carried the quiet dignity of someone returning something important to its place. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The airport noise flowed around them again. Suitcases, announcements, footsteps. Rachel realized something unexpected in that silence. Sometimes the truth about a person doesn't arrive through a confession. Sometimes it appears through the way they refuse to claim credit for something beautiful. Brandon stood and began rearranging the books again, just as he had been doing all afternoon. The same calm movements, the same quiet presence. Rachel leaned back slightly in her chair. She didn't press further. Some discoveries were better allowed to breathe on their own. Across from her, Mia returned to reading her book as if nothing unusual had happened at all. And in the soft glow of the airport lights, Brandon Cole continued placing books carefully onto the shelf, like a man who understood that some stories were meant to travel quietly through the world without their author ever stepping into the spotlight. Evening settled slowly over San Diego International Airport. Outside the tall terminal windows, the sky had turned a deep shade of blue, the kind that appears just after sunset, when the last traces of daylight fade behind the horizon. Runway lights blinked quietly in the distance, like small constellations guiding aircraft through the night. Inside the terminal, the airport had entered its second rhythm of the day. The hurried morning travelers were gone. In their place were tired passengers waiting for late flights, families gathered around charging stations, and solitary travelers staring thoughtfully through the glass at the aircraft waiting beyond. Soft overhead lights reflected across the polished floor. The calm voice of the airport announcer drifted through the air once more. Flight 904 to Dallas is now boarding at Gate 17. And in the quiet corner beside the small free library, Brandon Cole continued arranging books as if nothing unusual had happened. Rachel Morgan still stood near the shelf. The conversation from a few minutes earlier lingered in the air like a quiet ripple that had not yet settled. She glanced once more at the quiet harbor, resting between two other books on the middle shelf. Then she turned back toward Brandon. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "for years people tried to find the man who wrote that book." Brandon continued straightening the spine of a paperback novel. "Yes," he said simply. Rachel watched him carefully. There was no change in his expression, no curiosity, no surprise, just quiet acknowledgement. She leaned lightly against the side of the bookshelf. Publishers searched, she continued. Readers searched. Journalists, too. She smiled faintly. "My commanding officer once told me there was a rumor the author lived somewhere near the coast." Brandon slid another book gently into place. "Rumors travel easily," he said. Rachel folded her arms loosely. "But no one ever found him." Brandon nodded once. "That happens sometimes." Rachel tilted her head. "You don't seem very curious about that." Brandon finally looked up. His eyes were calm, the same steady calm Rachel had noticed from the moment she first approached the shelf. "I suppose the book found the people it needed to find," he said. That was always the important part. Rachel studied him for a moment. The airport noise flowed around them again. Footsteps, suitcases, a distant burst of laughter from a nearby cafe. None of the travelers passing through the terminal had any idea that the quiet man arranging books beside the window was at the center of a mystery readers had wondered about for years. Rachel rested her hand lightly on the shelf. "People asked the same question again and again," she said. Brandon waited. Rachel spoke the question out loud. Why did the author disappear? For the first time since their conversation began, Brandon paused. Not dramatically, just long enough for the silence between them to deepen slightly. His eyes drifted toward the runway lights beyond the glass. Then he looked back at Rachel. I suppose he said gently because he never wanted to be famous. Rachel raised an eyebrow. That simple? Brandon smiled faintly. Fame has a way of changing quiet things. Rachel considered that. Many people spent their lives chasing recognition. The world often rewarded loud voices, bold gestures, dramatic success. Yet here was a man who spoke about it as if it were something unnecessary. Most writers would disagree with you, Rachel said. Most writers hope their work will be remembered. Brandon nodded slowly. That's true. Then he added almost thoughtfully, but sometimes a story doesn't need the author standing beside it. Rachel felt the meaning of the sentence settle quietly between them. She looked again at the bookshelf, at the worn copy of The Quiet Harbor, at the handwritten line inside its cover. Then, back at Brandon. A realization had been forming in her mind for several minutes now. Not sudden, not dramatic, just a quiet certainty becoming clearer with every word. Rachel spoke softly. There were rumors about the author, you know. Brandon tilted his head slightly. Oh, some people said he had been through something difficult. Rachel paused. Something that made him write that book. Brandon didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached down and picked up a children's book Mia had left on the table earlier. He placed it neatly back on the shelf. Rachel watched him do it. The same careful movements. The same calm attention to small details. Finally, she said the thought that had been waiting quietly inside her. You're the one who wrote this book, aren't you? The question hung in the air. For a moment, the sounds of the airport seemed distant. Brandon's gaze moved slowly toward the quiet harbor. The worn blue cover caught the reflection of the overhead lights. He studied it the way someone might look at an old photograph. Not with pride, not with regret, just with quiet familiarity. Then he looked back at Rachel. Yes, he said. Nothing more. No explanation. No dramatic confession. Just a simple truth spoken in the same calm voice he had used all evening. Rachel felt the air leave her lungs in a slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For years, the identity of the author had been a mystery to thousands of readers, and now she was standing in an airport beside him while he arranged second-hand books for strangers. It was almost absurd in its simplicity. She laughed softly, not out of disbelief, but out of quiet amazement. I had a feeling. Brandon gave a small shrug. Rachel looked back at the book. You have no idea how many people searched for you. Brandon's expression remained peaceful. Did they? Rachel stepped a little closer to the shelf. I've met veterans who said that book helped them survive their darkest years. She paused. Families, too. She ran her hand gently across the cover. You wrote something that gave people permission to keep living. Brandon listened without interrupting. Rachel's voice softened. You have no idea how many lives this book changed. Brandon smiled. Not proudly, just warmly. I'm glad it helped, he said. That was all. Rachel looked at him again, trying to understand the quiet humility of the man standing before her. In a world where success often meant attention interviews and applause, Brandon Cole had chosen something different. He had stepped away from recognition, from praise, from the bright lights that might have followed the book's success. Some writers hope their names will outlive their stories. But sometimes the most generous writers leave their stories behind and quietly step aside, allowing the words to belong entirely to the readers who need them. Rachel realized that was exactly what Brandon had done. He had written something powerful enough to help strangers heal. Then he had returned to a quiet life where the only thing that mattered was the next book placed gently into someone's hands. Outside, another aircraft lifted slowly into the dark sky. Inside the terminal, passengers continued their journeys, without noticing the quiet conversation beside the little airport library. Rachel stood still for a moment longer. Then she nodded once with genuine respect. You really did disappear, Brandon chuckled softly. Not completely. He gestured toward the bookshelf. I just found a quieter place to be. Rachel followed his gaze. The small shelf, the soft airport lights, Mia reading happily in her chair, a quiet corner where stories continued traveling quietly through the hands of strangers. And in that moment, Rachel understood something important. Sometimes the most extraordinary people are the ones who choose the simplest lives. Brandon picked up another book and placed it gently onto the shelf. The same calm gesture he had made 100 times that day. And the quiet corner of the airport returned once again to the peaceful rhythm it had always known. Night had fully settled over San Diego International Airport. Beyond the tall glass windows, the runway lights stretched into the distance like quiet constellations, guiding aircraft through the darkness. Every few minutes, a plane rolled slowly toward takeoff, its engines humming low before rising into the night sky. Inside the terminal, the rhythm of the airport had softened. The loud morning rush had long passed. Travelers now moved with slower steps, people waiting for late departures, parents calming sleepy children, couples sitting quietly beside charging stations. Overhead lights cast a warm glow across the polished floor. From time to time, the airport speakers spoke in their steady, gentle tone. Flight 417 to Chicago, now boarding at Gate 24. And beside the small bookshelf in the quiet corner near the windows, Brandon Cole continued placing books carefully back into their rows. Rachel Morgan stood nearby, her arms folded loosely as she watched him. She had just learned something remarkable. The quiet man arranging second-hand books in an airport was the writer whose words had helped thousands of strangers through their darkest moments. Yet nothing about Brandon's manner suggested pride or accomplishment. He looked exactly as he had earlier that afternoon. Calm, patient, completely at ease in his small corner of the world. Rachel broke the silence gently. "Can I ask you something?" Brandon glanced up. "Of course." Rachel hesitated for a moment, choosing her words carefully. Then she asked the question that had been forming in her mind since he admitted the truth. "Why did you write the book?" The question hung softly between them. Brandon didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze drifted toward the row of chairs nearby. Mia sat there, with her legs tucked beneath her, reading quietly under the warm airport lights. Every few minutes, she turned a page, her expression thoughtful and peaceful, in the way only children absorbed in stories can be. Brandon watched her for a moment. Rachel noticed the look in his eyes. Not sadness, something gentler, something deeper, a memory. Finally, Brandon spoke. "My wife used to say, books were like lighthouses," he said quietly. Rachel waited. She believed stories could guide people through storms they couldn't explain. He paused. "She was a doctor." Rachel nodded slowly. "Emergency medicine." Brandon smiled faintly. "Volunteer work mostly." He rested his hands lightly on the edge of the shelf. She believed the world needed more kindness than it usually received. The airport announcement echoed faintly again. Passengers walked past the small library without noticing the quiet conversation unfolding there. Rachel listened closely. "And the book?" she asked softly. Brandon looked down at the quiet harbor, resting among the other books. "She passed away many years ago." Rachel didn't interrupt. There was no drama in his voice, just calm truth spoken gently, like someone describing a distant season of life. After she was gone, Brandon continued. The house became very quiet. His eyes drifted briefly toward the window, where runway lights blinked in the distance. "I had a lot of thoughts I didn't know what to do with." He gave a small shrug. "So I started writing them down." Rachel understood immediately. Writing was sometimes the only place grief could breathe. Brandon spoke slowly, choosing his words the way someone might step carefully across stones in a river. At first, it wasn't meant to be a book. "What was it meant to be?" Rachel asked. Brandon smiled faintly. A place to put the silence. Rachel felt something tighten gently in her chest. He continued. "I wrote about the things people experience when loss arrives quietly. Loneliness, confusion, the strange feeling that the world keeps moving, even when part of you has stopped." Rachel nodded. She knew that feeling well. Brandon looked again toward Mia. She had reached the end of her chapter and was smiling to herself. Rachel followed his gaze. "She must have been very young then," Rachel said softly. Brandon nodded. "She was too." The corner of his mouth lifted in a gentle smile. She didn't understand what had happened. But she understood something else. Rachel tilted her head slightly. What? That I needed to keep living? He chuckled quietly. She would bring me books from the shelf and say, "Daddy read." Rachel smiled. Children had a way of reminding adults how to breathe again. Brandon turned the worn copy of The Quiet Harbor slightly in his hands. I didn't write the book to be remembered. His voice was steady. I wrote it so people who felt lost could breathe again. The words settled into the quiet space between them. Rachel felt their meaning immediately, because she had been one of those people once. She remembered the night she had first opened the book, the quiet apartment, the heavy silence after a difficult chapter of her life, and the strange relief she had felt while reading those pages. She looked at Brandon again. That's why it felt different, she said softly. Different from other books. Brandon didn't respond. He simply returned the book gently to its place on the shelf. Across the room, Mia looked up from her story. Daddy. Yes, did you know foxes sometimes pretend to be asleep when they're actually watching everything? Brandon chuckled. I didn't know that. Mia grinned proudly and returned to her book. Rachel watched the exchange. It was such a small moment. Yet it explained everything. The quiet father, the little library, the calm life he had chosen. Loss had not hardened Brandon Cole. It had softened him. Rachel spoke quietly. Now I understand why the book felt so real. Brandon didn't reply. He simply picked up another book and straightened its cover before placing it neatly into the row. Outside, another aircraft lifted slowly into the dark sky. Inside the airport, travelers continued moving toward their gates. And in the small corner beside the quiet bookshelf, the story behind The Quiet Harbor settled gently into the night. No longer a mystery, but something far more meaningful. A story written not for fame, but for healing. Brandon stepped back slightly, looking over the shelf to make sure everything was in place. Rachel stood beside him in respectful silence. Nearby, Mia turned another page. The airport lights glowed warmly above them, and for a brief moment, the busy terminal seemed to pause just long enough for three strangers to share the quiet understanding that some stories are born not from success, but from love that refuses to disappear. The evening hours at San Diego International Airport carried a different kind of energy than the daytime rush. By now, the terminal had softened into a slower rhythm. Travelers sat quietly near their gates, their voices lower, their movements calmer. Outside the wide glass windows, the runway lights shimmered against the dark sky, while aircraft moved steadily across the tarmac, like patient travelers of their own. Inside, the glow of the overhead lamps warmed the polished floors. From somewhere down the terminal came the gentle murmur of a television broadcast. Coffee machines hissed softly behind a nearby cafe counter. Occasionally, the calm voice of the airport announcement system drifted through the air. Flight 612 to Portland, now boarding at Gate 9. In the quiet corner beside the small free library, Brandon Cole continued doing exactly what he had been doing all evening. He arranged books, straightened spines, placed returned novels carefully back onto the shelves. Nothing about his movements suggested that anything unusual had happened, yet something subtle had changed. Rachel Morgan stood nearby, leaning lightly against one of the chairs, as she watched the small scene unfolding around the bookshelf. The conversation she had shared with Brandon a few minutes earlier had not gone unnoticed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly. The older man in the worn denim jacket, the one who had earlier mentioned reading The Quiet Harbor, had been listening from his seat nearby. Now he stood slowly and walked toward the shelf. He moved with the steady gait of someone who had carried both years and memories for a long time. When he reached the shelf, he picked up the worn blue book, The Quiet Harbor. He held it in both hands for a moment, studying the cover with quiet familiarity. Then he looked toward Brandon. For a second, their eyes met. The man gave a small nod. Not a salute, not a dramatic gesture, just a simple acknowledgement between two people who understood something about storms. "Thank you," the man said quietly. His voice carried the calm strength of someone who had lived long enough to know how difficult those words could sometimes be. Brandon inclined his head gently. "You're welcome." No explanation followed. None was needed. The man returned the book to the shelf, carefully, almost respectfully, before walking back toward his seat. Rachel watched the moment closely. There had been no applause, no announcement. Yet the small exchange felt more meaningful than any public recognition. A few minutes later, another traveler approached the shelf. This time, it was a middle-aged woman carrying a soft leather bag and a boarding pass tucked between her fingers. She paused when she saw the title on the shelf. "The Quiet Harbor," she said softly. Her eyes moved toward Brandon. "I read that book after my sister passed." She hesitated briefly, as if deciding whether to say more. It helped me understand what she had been going through. Her voice remained gentle, but Rachel could hear the emotion beneath it. Brandon listened quietly. "I'm glad it helped," he said. The woman nodded once. Then she placed her hand lightly on the book's cover before stepping away toward the boarding area. From her chair nearby, Mia had been watching everything. She was no longer reading. Her book rested forgotten on her lap as she observed the quiet interactions unfolding around her father. Children notice things adults sometimes overlook, and Mia noticed the way strangers spoke to Brandon differently now. Not loudly, but gently, with the kind of respect that grows naturally when people recognize something meaningful in another person. She slid off her chair and walked over to Brandon. "Daddy," she whispered, tugging lightly at the sleeve of his sweater. Brandon looked down at her. "Yes." Mia leaned closer. "Daddy, they like your book." Brandon's eyes softened. He followed her gaze briefly toward the shelf, toward the worn copy of The Quiet Harbor, resting among the other books. Then he smiled. "That means the book found the people who needed it." Mia seemed satisfied with that answer. She returned to her chair and picked up her story again, though Rachel noticed she continued glancing proudly toward her father from time to time. Across the terminal, travelers continued moving through their journeys. Some hurried toward final boarding calls. Others sat quietly waiting for flights that would take them across the country or across oceans. Very few of them knew that in this quiet corner of the airport stood a man whose words had helped countless strangers through moments of grief, loneliness, and uncertainty. But perhaps that was exactly the way Brandon preferred it. He did not stand beside the bookshelf expecting recognition. He did not pause his work when someone spoke to him. Instead, he continued doing the same simple tasks he had been doing all evening. Straightening books, helping travelers choose stories, keeping the little library alive. Rachel watched him thoughtfully. There was something deeply moving about the way respect had appeared here. It had not arrived through loud praise or dramatic gestures. It had appeared in nods, in soft voices, in the careful way strangers returned the book to the shelf. Sometimes the most genuine respect is not announced. It reveals itself quietly when people recognize the meaning of something and honor it without needing to draw attention. Rachel stepped closer to Brandon. "You changed more lives than you probably know," she said softly. Brandon looked at her. Then he gave a small nod. Stories have a way of traveling farther than the people who write them. Before Rachel could reply, a young boy approached the shelf holding a small dinosaur toy. He stared uncertainly at the rows of books. Brandon knelt down beside him immediately. "Looking for an adventure?" Brandon asked gently. The boy nodded. Brandon studied the shelf for a moment before pulling out a brightly illustrated book. "This one has explorers," he said, "and a hidden island." The boy's eyes lit up. Rachel watched the exchange with a quiet smile. In that moment, Brandon Cole was no longer the mysterious author readers had searched for across the country. He was simply a man helping a child discover a story. And somehow that felt exactly right. The small airport library returned once more to its peaceful rhythm. Books rested quietly on the shelf. Travelers passed through the terminal. Mia turned another page of her story. And in the quiet corner beside the windows, Brandon continued doing the work he loved, one book at a time. By the time the evening settled fully into night, San Diego International Airport had grown quieter. The terminal was not empty. Airports rarely are, but the energy had softened. Many travelers had already boarded their flights, leaving behind rows of half-filled chairs and scattered islands of quiet conversations. Soft golden lights reflected on the polished floor. Outside the tall glass windows, aircraft lights blinked patiently across the runway, while the dark Pacific sky stretched above them. From time to time, the airport speakers spoke gently into the air. "Passengers for Flight 219 to Denver, please proceed to Gate 14. The voice faded quickly, leaving the terminal once again, wrapped in its calm evening rhythm. Near the window beside the little free library, Brandon Cole continued working the same way he always did. Slowly, carefully. He had begun tidying the shelf for the night. A returned mystery novel was placed neatly beside 2 travel memoirs. A worn children's book had its corner smoothed flat. One by one, the books settled back into their quiet rows. A few feet away, Mia sat in her chair, with a new story resting on her lap. Every few moments, the soft sound of a page turning reached the air between them. Rachel Morgan remained nearby. Her flight had not boarded yet, but even if it had, she suspected she might still have stayed a little longer. There was something about the quiet corner beside the bookshelf that made the airport feel different from the rest of the world outside. She watched Brandon help Mia choose the book earlier. The girl had held up 3 options, asking her father which one had the best adventure. Brandon had studied them thoughtfully, before pointing to a worn paperback with a picture of a forest path. "That one," he had said. "Why?" Mia asked. "Because stories that start in quiet places often go the farthest." Mia seemed satisfied with that answer and had begun reading immediately. Now she sat with her legs folded beneath her, her attention completely absorbed in the story. Rachel smiled to herself. Then she turned back toward Brandon. He was adjusting the last row of books on the shelf when she spoke. "Can I ask you one more question?" Brandon glanced over his shoulder. "Of course." Rachel hesitated for a moment. The question she wanted to ask felt simple, yet it carried a weight she did not want to present carelessly. Finally, she said it. "Do you ever regret leaving that life behind?" Brandon did not answer right away. Instead, he finished placing the final book into the row. Then he rested his hands lightly on the edge of the shelf and looked toward Mia. The little girl had reached the end of her chapter and now sat quietly staring at the illustration on the page, as if imagining the world inside the book. Her expression was peaceful. Rachel watched Brandon watching her. There was something unmistakable in his eyes. Not sadness, not longing, just quiet certainty. Finally, Brandon spoke. "No," he said gently. Rachel waited. Brandon's gaze remained on his daughter. "Fame is an interesting thing," he continued calmly. "People imagine it brings clarity." He paused for a moment. "But often, it only makes life louder." Rachel nodded slightly. She understood that truth from her own world. In aviation, recognition often came after dangerous moments, moments that most pilots would rather have avoided entirely. Brandon continued speaking quietly. When the book became popular, people expected me to step forward. Interviews, events, talk shows. He gave a small shrug. But I had already spent a long time writing about finding peace. Rachel noticed his voice soften slightly, and eventually I realized something. Rachel asked quietly, "What was that?" Brandon smiled. Then he spoke the word slowly. "I spent years writing about finding peace." His eyes moved again toward Mia. I finally realized it was right here. Rachel followed his gaze. The small chair, the child reading under the soft airport lights, the quiet corner filled with books. It was such a simple scene, yet somehow it explained everything. Rachel leaned back slightly in her chair. Most people would have chosen differently. Brandon nodded. "Maybe." Rachel studied him thoughtfully. "You gave up a lot." Brandon considered that for a moment. Then he shook his head gently. "No." His voice was calm. "I traded something for what Rachel asked." Brandon gestured toward Mia. "For time." Rachel understood immediately. Time to raise his daughter. Time to sit beside her while she read stories. Time to live quietly rather than constantly explaining himself to the world. There are many kinds of success. Some are measured in headlines, awards, and applause. Others are measured in evenings spent beside the people who matter most. Brandon had chosen the second kind. Rachel watched Mia turn another page. The soft sound of paper moving in the quiet terminal felt strangely comforting. "I think your book makes more sense to me now," she said. Brandon looked back toward her. He nodded once. "I'm glad." Rachel stood slowly. Her boarding time was approaching. She glanced once more at the small library, the worn books, the quiet shelf, the man who had written something powerful enough to reach thousands of strangers and then chosen to step away from recognition so he could build a life filled with quieter things. Brandon returned to arranging the final few books of the evening. One by one, he aligned them neatly along the shelf. Mia closed her book and looked up. "Daddy." "Yes, can I read one more chapter before we go home?" Brandon smiled. "I think we can make time for that." Mia beamed and opened the book again. Rachel watched them for a moment longer. Then she picked up her carry-on bag. The airport speakers announced another boarding call in the distance. Passengers began gathering their things. Rachel gave Brandon a final respectful nod. He returned it quietly. And in the soft glow of the terminal lights, the little airport library remained exactly as it had always been, a quiet harbor in the middle of a busy world. The final boarding call for Rachel Morgan's flight echoed gently through the terminal. "Passengers traveling to Seattle on Flight 782, please proceed to Gate 19. The announcement drifted across the evening air of San Diego International Airport, soft and familiar, like hundreds of other announcements that had filled the building throughout the day. Most travelers heard it as a signal to hurry. But Rachel paused for one last moment. She stood beside the small bookshelf near the windows, her carry-on bag resting at her side. The quiet corner of the terminal seemed unchanged from when she first noticed it earlier that afternoon. Rows of worn paperbacks, children's books with colorful covers, travel memoirs and old novels whose pages carried the faint scent of time. Above the shelf, the simple wooden sign still read, "Take a book, leave a book," or "Just rest a moment." It was such an ordinary thing, and yet it had quietly changed the course of her evening. Rachel turned once more toward Brandon Cole. He stood a few feet away, kneeling beside a small boy who clutched a toy airplane in one hand. The boy stared uncertainly at the books. "I've never picked a book before," the child admitted. Brandon smiled gently. That means you get to choose your first adventure. The boy's eyes widened. Are adventures in books real? Brandon considered the question carefully. Sometimes, he said, they're the most real adventures we ever have. He reached for a thin paperback with a picture of a lighthouse on the cover. This one might be a good place to start. The boy accepted the book with cautious curiosity. Rachel watched the small moment unfold. Brandon's voice was calm, patient, exactly the same as it had been all evening. There was no trace of the recognition she had offered him earlier, no sign that he had once written words that traveled across the country, helping strangers breathe through grief. He simply continued being the same quiet man who kept a small airport library alive. Nearby, Mia had closed her book and was watching Rachel with thoughtful eyes. Children often sensed when someone was about to leave. She slid off her chair and walked toward the shelf. Rachel smiled down at her. "Looks like it's time for my flight." Mia nodded. Then she reached toward the shelf and carefully pulled out a small paperback. She held it out with both hands. "For you." Rachel looked surprised. "Oh, I couldn't take your book." Mia shook her head. "It's not mine." Rachel accepted the book and glanced at the cover. "Is this your dad's book?" she asked gently. Mia smiled. "No." Her voice carried the quiet certainty children sometimes possess. "This is just another story someone might need." Rachel felt warmth spread through her chest. The answer sounded very much like something Brandon might say. She slipped the book into her carry-on bag. "Thank you." Mia gave a small wave before returning to her chair. Rachel turned back toward Brandon. He was already standing again, placing a returned book neatly onto the shelf. For a moment, their eyes met. Rachel gave him a small, respectful nod. "Safe travels," Brandon said. "Thank you." There was nothing dramatic in the farewell, just quiet understanding. Rachel picked up her bag and began walking toward her gate. Behind her, the little airport library continued its quiet existence. Travelers passed. Books waited patiently. Mia opened another chapter of her story, and Brandon Cole adjusted the rows of paperbacks once more, making sure every book was easy to reach. A short while later, Rachel settled into her seat on the aircraft. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as passengers fastened their seatbelts and stowed their bags. Outside the window, the runway lights stretched across the dark ground like glowing threads. Rachel reached into her carry-on. She pulled out the book Mia had given her. The cover showed a simple illustration of a coastal village beneath a wide sky. She opened it slowly. On the first page, a familiar blue line of handwriting greeted her. Brandon's handwriting. Neat, calm, steady. The message read, "Stories are just quiet ways of reminding people they are not alone." Rachel smiled, not because the words were surprising, but because they felt completely true. She closed the book gently and rested it on her lap as the aircraft engines began to hum. Moments later, the plane rolled forward, then lifted slowly into the night sky. San Diego shrank beneath the wing. Runway lights faded into the distance, and somewhere far below the airport continued its quiet life. Back in the terminal near the tall windows and the little bookshelf, Brandon Cole remained exactly where he had been all evening. A young girl had just approached the shelf, her hands resting nervously on the edge. "Excuse me," she said. "Yes," Brandon replied. "I've never read a whole book before." Brandon knelt beside her, so they were eye level. "That means tonight could be your first one." The girl looked at the shelf with curiosity. "Which one should I start with?" Brandon studied the rows for a moment. Then he picked out a book and placed it gently in her hands. "Try this one." The girl examined the cover. "Is it a good story?" Brandon smiled. All stories are good when someone is ready to hear them. The girl nodded and sat down in one of the nearby chairs to begin reading. Mia looked up from her own book and watched proudly. Outside the windows, another airplane lifted slowly into the sky. Passengers continued moving through the terminal. Suitcases rolled across the floor. Announcements echoed softly in the distance. And in the quiet corner of the airport, the small library remained exactly what it had always been. A place where strangers could pause. A place where stories waited patiently for the people who needed them. Some people write books. Others simply live in a way that becomes a story for those around them. Brandon Cole had done both. Yet he seemed happiest doing the simplest part of all, helping the next person find a story worth opening. And so the little library continued its quiet work, one book. One reader, one moment at a time, not ending, just continuing. Every single day.